Lisa,
Yes, baby girl.
when I grow up, I want to be a woman to society.
Then so shall you be. Hey, this is Lisa Landry. Welcome to Menace to Society. I have the great privilege of sitting down today with Hannibal B. Johnson of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a very distinguished gentleman. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely. It's great to be here.
You're an author, an attorney, a consultant, and also a professor at OU and OSU, so your time is very valuable. Thank you very much for being here. And tell me, are you originally from Tulsa?
I actually grew up in Mineral Wells, Texas as a young kid, and then went to high school, junior high in Fort Smith, Arkansas. So Fort Smith, Arkansas is really my hometown. I've lived in Tulsa for more than 30 years. So all my adult professional life, I've lived in Tulsa.
Okay.
So
you came from oil land, huh? Isn't that Texas? Isn't that kind of out in the panhandle?
Oklahoma is kind of the oil. Tulsa was once the oil capital of the world in the early part of the 20th century.
I never would have
That's
known
part
that.
of part of the distinction. That's what drew people to Tulsa initially.
And I was ignorant of the fact that there was a Black Wall Street here. Is that because of the oil industry?
It's because of some really visionary pioneers, African American people who saw opportunity here in Tulsa and created what was an entrepreneurial mecca. Became known as Black Wall Street for all the businesses that proliferated here in Tulsa, beginning in about 1905, devastated by the cataclysmic 1921 Tulsa race riot, and then rebuilt after the devastation of the riot to great prominence. And the peak of the Black Wall Street era really is in the early to mid 1940s.
So they rebuilt it and then it got bigger about 2 decades after?
Right. After the riot, it actually grew bigger than it had been prior to the riot, but then began to decline for a number of reasons in the 60s and 70s. Integration, urban renewal, the change of the overall economy structurally, all those things were factors that led to the relative decline of the Greenwood district as an entrepreneurial mecca, which is what it's known for, the Black Wall Street.
And you're an authority on this completely. Now, you've written 2 books and also a children's book on this topic. So tell me about this riot. What happened? How'd that come about?
So I have 3 books that cover this history. One is Black Wall Street, From Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's historic Greenwood district. That's a historical chronological narrative. A book called Tulsa's Historic Greenwood District, which is a photographic narrative using 200 plus photos to tell the story of the history of the Greenwood district. And a book called Up from the Ashes, which is a children's book written on 3rd grade reading level that tells this history. So Tulsa has the dubious distinction of being the site of the worst of the so-called race riots in American history. These were events that happened all throughout the country, and in fact 1919, known as Red Summer, labeled Red Summer by James Weldon Johnson of the NAACP, was a year in which there were more than 25 of these so-called race riots throughout America in places like Washington, D.C., and Omaha, Nebraska, Elaine, Arkansas, New York,
And it's
Chicago.
about 100 years ago.
Right.
Okay.
So all these incidents happened almost 100 years ago. Racial violence was at its peak. Not only were these so-called riots happening, lynching was happening. Lynching is domestic terrorism.
Yeah.
It's a way of punishing particularly black people, more often than not, for some perceived or real social slight or legal infraction with the intent to send a message to the entire black community about their relative place in society.
Stay in line, you'll be fine.
So that's the context in which the 1921 disturbance here in Tulsa happened. Race riot really is not an accurate term for these events. Mm-hmm. These events could better be described as massacres, as assaults, as pogroms, as burnings, as terrorist incidents. All those are better descriptors for what happened. But they've been labeled riot historically because, think about it, who was doing the labeling? It wasn't African American people who were giving these events their designations. So in Tulsa, a very successful black community that sits really right across the railroad tracks, the Frisco railroad tracks from downtown Tulsa. So it's a valuable and desirable part of the community in terms of the property. So a lot of people wanted it. The railroads wanted it. Industrialists wanted it. And so that was part of the issue, what I call land lust. Another part of the issue, I think clearly, given the racial context, was jealousy over the success of African Americans in Tulsa. When African American people during this day, the majority of white people perceived African Americans to be inferior,
Right.
if not subhuman. And so how could these people be so successful? That was an issue.
Because we're looking at not too long from when the emancipation happened, like chronologically.
Right.
So, yeah.
Not long at all.
Right. So there's all this blowback of,
Right.
yeah, jealousy and.
Right. And again, a valuable part of the community in terms of how the land is positioned, abutting downtown, that's an issue. There were issues around media who fanned the flames of hostility that resulted in the riot. There was the growth and burgeoning of the Ku Klux Klan here in Tulsa, which kicked off in the early 1920s, but really blossomed after the devastation of the riot, not just in Tulsa, but in Oklahoma generally. So all these, it's a confluence of all these factors together that led us to this event that we call the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot, the largest of the so-called race riots in American history. We know that somewhere between 100 and 300 people lost their lives. Most of those people were black. Some 1,250 structures, homes, and businesses were destroyed.
That's a lot, too, because there's not a lot of buildings out here even now. Like when you think of a big city, which Tulsa is a large city.
It's a large city, certainly geographically. In terms of land mass, it's a very large city. It's not densely populated. That's the difference between Tulsa and, for example, San Francisco or New York City.
Right. You're spread out here.
It's yeah, there's more dispersion of people. So many African Americans, after having lost their homes and all their valuables, spent days, weeks, months living in tent cities that were constructed by the Red Cross, who came in to provide relief.
Did they do a good job? Because
The
FEMA
Red
kind
Cross
of messed up
the
Katrina.
Red Cross did a great job.
Oh, yeah? That's great.
By all accounts, black and white. In fact, the Red Cross was called Angels of Mercy because they did such an incredible job. But again, you had black people who were displaced from their homes. They lost all their property. So they were in really dire straits.
And I would imagine this is before people had insurance. Like, people don't really have insurance so much now, but back then I'm sure you didn't have to have it if you bought a home.
Well, it didn't
I would
matter.
think
It
the
didn't matter if you had
regulation-
insurance because most insurance policies during the day had a clause that excluded damage that was occasioned by riot or civil unrest. And that's why...
So they had their out.
That's why a lot of the leading white authorities wanted to characterize the incident as a race riot, right? So the insurance claims did not pay out. Mount Zion Baptist Church is one of the structures that was destroyed. It's a beautiful black church that was built just really literally weeks before the riot took place. And it was burned down during the riot. They did have an insurance policy, but the insurance policy had an exclusionary clause.
Ugh. Wow.
So that's sort of emblematic of this history of destruction and lack of accountability on the part of the leadership.
It's an ongoing battle, isn't it?
It is.
In a lot of respects. So there's all this devastation. You've lost everything. How do you rebuild?
Yeah, you rebuild by doing things like driving to Kansas to get lumber, and they had a lot of difficulty in even buying the supplies they needed to rebuild locally, so they had to go to other places to do that.
And was that because of segregation, or is it because certain shops wouldn't sell to the African American community?
It was because of racism, structural racism that obviously we still deal with. But fortunately, the real story here is the story of the human spirit, as I see it. It's about the fortitude of the people who lived here and were committed to this place and would not be frightened away from what they considered to be home. So they found ways to rebuild. They borrowed money from other folks, family and relatives in other places. They got the support of organizations like the NAACP in New York City who sent a contribution here. People more broadly dispersed throughout the United States were very interested in rebuilding in Tulsa to send a message about what they considered to be their rightful place in society.
Do you think part of that was because it was so egregious what happened here? The devastation was so extreme that you got the label of the worst that happened? during that time?
When I say it was the worst of the race riots, I'm talking about in terms of physical damage, in terms of lives lost, in terms of all the metrics that you could use to gauge how damaging a riot is. Tulsa's the worst, right? And it's the worst because it was highly developed, right? I mean, we had a proliferation of black businesses here.
So there's more to lose.
Right, there's more to lose, and the message about rebuilding is then crystal clear to people throughout the United States. We must rebuild to send a message. So that's why the National Negro Business League, the Black Chamber of Commerce, started by Booker T. Washington, held their 1925 national conference here in Tulsa as a signal that this place is meant to be, that Black Wall Street's not going anywhere, that we're here, that we have support throughout the nation.
Beautiful. And so, given that support, did that help to move things along so that you became so big in the 40s, that the Wall Street that's here, the Black Wall Street, was that part of it?
Right. I think it was a commitment to the place, and the message that the rebuilding sends to the larger community about this is our home too. We shall not be moved. That's the clear message that the rebuilding sent.
And I think it's wild. I think a lot of people don't come to Oklahoma, I would think. A lot of Americans don't ever travel here. So when you don't come here, you think, Oklahoma, okay, cowboys, a lot of Native Americans, indigenous people, but you don't really think African American community until you come here.
But that's a curriculum problem, because ignorance, in the dictionary sense, not knowing, is a product of having a curriculum in our public school systems and elsewhere that doesn't teach us our history that we need to know.
Oh, there's a lot of stuff missing.
Oklahoma has some of the richest history of any state in the United States, and it's based on the confluence of the population groups, European Americans, African Americans, and Native Americans, and their interactions throughout the decades and centuries. And it's shameful that people don't know that history, but they don't know it because it's not part of the curriculum.
Well, there's a lot of diversity here, and I think that's one of your main focuses too. I understand that you do a lot to share knowledge and promote diversity here.
The diversity and inclusion is one of my consulting specialties, and I've been engaged in diversity and inclusion for more than 25 years. So I do lectures, I do trainings, I've taught cultural diversity at the University of Oklahoma. So that's a big thing for me, and so my circle of acquaintances and friendships and contacts is very broad, and I value having input from people of all persuasions. It makes me a better person.
Yeah, it makes us more well-rounded. Yeah, because you get to see things from a different perspective. You get to find out things that you never would have learned before.
Absolutely.
We're all teaching and learning from each other, you know. I'm a big old hippie. I believe that. So tell me, how did you get started with the diversity training? Like, what led you to that path?
Interesting question. I'm not sure. So I've always been a fan of diversity and inclusion before the terms were really coined, right? I always had a circle of friends and colleagues that were different from me. I'm a mixed group of people, as far back as I can remember. I don't remember not having that diversity in my life, so it's natural for me. Having said that, I was on residence hall staff as a student at the University of Arkansas when I was in college, as an undergraduate, and I was on specifically the Minority Programs Committee that brought programming and speakers and so forth to the campus.
And what year was this?
This was in the late 70s, early 80s. And so we brought, for example, Coretta Scott King, the widow of Dr. King, and just things like that. We did things like that. And that was sort of at the beginning of this movement that is diversity and inclusion now. Since then, I've done things like, for example, for 15, 16 years, I directed a diversity and inclusion leadership camp for teenagers through a group called the Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice. And it's a week-long summer camp that meets in a camp setting in the woods, but it's all about immersion in diversity and inclusion and learning and taking leadership skills from that.
So it's like Survivor. You take these kids out in the wilderness. If they don't get along, they'll die.
It's not quite that stark. They will get along, is the point, and they know that it's a safe environment, and they learn with and from one another, and they get to have experiences with one another that they wouldn't otherwise have because they're deliberate. we construct the experiences, have them talk about the hard topics, sexism, racism, homophobia, all those sorts of things. Like, teenagers are perfectly capable of talking about and working through those concepts if there's proper facilitation. And that's a big if. But this camp is it's a tried and true model, and it does a great job of really changing people for a lifetime. Some of those teenagers who went to the camp when I was director years ago are obviously now adults. Some of them are working in the community. Some of them are lawyers and doctors and whatever. And when I run across them, it's always, a hug and a talk about how profound that experience was for them.
Yeah, especially at that age, I would reckon.
Yeah,
'cause it opens your
16 and
perception
17.
for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and obviously teenagers are dealing with these issues whether they articulate them or not. They're dealing with issues of racism and sexism and homophobia. They deal with those things in their own ways. And we at the camp, try to give them skills to deal with them in ways that are more productive.
Are these kids, how do they find you? Are they going through a program and need to come to you?
No.
Or how does that work?
It's a mix of, and I don't do it anymore, but the camp's still going on. I'm not involved. The kids are kids who want to come. So some of them are jocks, and some of them are cheerleaders, and some of them are kids who attend alternative schools, and they're from all walks of life throughout the state of Oklahoma.
That's really cool.
That's part of the point. That's diversity.
Right.
Right?
So do you bus any kids in from Kansas just for kicks?
The model operates in different places, not just here in Tulsa. So,
I know.
yeah.
I'm just playing with you.
So and the key is that we're focused on our state because we want to. So our goal is to sort of build teenagers and young adults here in the state, because the group is the Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice. It's a state organization.
And how many kids go to the camp, or do you have maybe
Roughly 60 per year.
That's a good
And
chunk.
it started in 1994, so a lot of kids have gone through.
That's beautiful what you've built. And you seem like a guy who just steps up and tries to make things better. I mean, I don't know you that well, but from what I've seen online and just sitting down with you, it's like, okay, well, this needs to happen. I guess I'll go get it started.
Yeah, and I'm not. I don't want to take credit for creating a bunch of stuff. I do the things that I think need to be done, and I want to do, because I feel it's important to contribute. And I've always felt that way, and that's part of what I get from my parents. My father was president of an NAACP chapter in Texas. He was active in Arkansas. My mother was active in church. So they always believed in community service, community leadership, and the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, as they say. And so that's always been a part of what I do.
And now you're working on a new book.
Right.
This would be how many now? 9?
9.
Your 9th book. And what's the name of this one?
This is a book, it's a biography. It's about a couple called the Sauners who lived in Chandler, Oklahoma in the early part of the 20th century. A remarkable black couple who are not commemorated in historical textbooks, but are really remarkable people. They were well known throughout the state in their time. Mr. Sauner, George Sauner, died in 1924. His wife, Lena Sauner, died in 1949. He was a lawyer, a cotton broker, a justice of the peace, a businessman. She was a school teacher, and actually a master school teacher who taught other teachers as well. They hobnobbed with governors, and even before Oklahoma was a state, territorial governors. They were involved in race relations throughout the state. He served on a commission formed by the governor after the 1921 Tulsa race riot. They were both very fair-skinned and could pass for, and were often mistaken for, white people. They chose not to go that route. Mm-hmm. Both of them could have passed if they had wanted to.
I have a cousin like that, yeah.
but they chose to identify as black and to work in the black community and to be bridge builders. Mm-hmm. And for that reason, if no other, they should be memorialized in our historical texts, and they're not.
But you're bringing them back.
Right. It's important that somebody celebrate them.
It's extremely important. There's so much history that doesn't make it into the books, the textbooks.
True.
You know. What of your books is your favorite? Like, if you had to pick one.
And people ask the question. I don't think it's possible to ask. Whatever book I'm working on is the favorite one.
It's getting all your
The most
attention.
well-known book is the Black Wall Street book, because the history of the Greenwood District, Black Wall Street, 1921 Tulsa Race Riot, all those are topics of conversation at a very high level, and they have been for 20 years. And it's only going to increase because we're approaching the 100th anniversary of the riot itself.
Thank you very much for sitting down with me today, Mr. Johnson.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for sharing a part of America's unsung history with us, Hannibal. And thanks, y'all, for listening. Please join me at lisalandry.com. I love you, Ari.